In this video, I'm going to give a brief overview of the rise of ancient Rome, and then I'll be focusing in on what I believe to be the three main pillars of ancient Rome's downfall. The Roman Empire. Let me tell you, as a man, this is a topic that is never far from my mind. Although you may think you have an idea of how the Roman Empire either rose or fell, I'm going to assume that there's probably some holes in your knowledge. And today, my goal is to fill those holes. Your holes. Rome, like all good stories, started from humble beginnings. In the very early days, circa 753 BC, Rome was primarily an asylum city and just a stop in the trade route between the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. What do I mean by asylum city? Rome started as a place where thieves, murderers, runaway slaves, outcasts, and more could have the rare opportunity to become genuine citizens. Rome was a city of refugees and immigrants. This openness, in part, gave Rome the opportunity to become as big as it eventually became. A lot of commonly considered Roman innovation was actually heavily inspired by their northern neighbors, the Etruscans, such as their alphabet, the gladiatorial games, and political structure. From the beginning in 753 BC to 509 BC, there was 7 kings, but in 509 BC, the last king of Rome was expelled for unsavory reasons, and from that point onward, it was decided that no one man should have all that power. The new system that was introduced gave 2 elected officials 1 year of power each, instead of a single monarch, which, if you think about it, is pretty crazy because whose idea was it to let butterflies rule anything anyway? Below the 2 elected officials was a senate of 300 patricians, which controlled the 2 elected officials, and below them were the plebs, the masses, essentially people just like the Senate, although they weren't born into the right family and therefore had no say. The plebs were mad about not having any real say in politics, and after 200 years of fighting, the Roman Republic was born. The plebs populated most of the army, so when the plebs weren't having their way, they'd threaten to emigrate and fight for other cities. Consistently over time, the Senate would begin submitting to their demands. Hey, if you don't give us any say in what goes on around here, we're gonna go fight for someone else.
What do you want? I'll do anything.
In 390 BC, Rome was almost entirely eliminated by a surprise attack, and although they survived the attack, this spooked them enough to trigger a serious military reform. The Roman legions were divided into multiple smaller groups known as manipula, allowing them to be more mobile and more efficient in battle. Over the next 200 years, the new military style was used to consistently expand and conquer. A 1000 IQ play used by Rome was, instead of ruining the settlements they'd conquer, they would actually impose treaties of alliance with their newly conquered partners, which would allow them to fuel the Roman legions, allowing them to have a seemingly endless army. By 133 BC, there began to be a serious divide within the people of Rome as the wealth gap grew exponentially and the impoverished no longer had anything to lose. The Senate and the Roman people were no longer a unity. Some people did try to suggest offering free bread and public land to the impoverished, but these people were killed by the Senate. Hey, what if we give these people that can't afford to do anything, like a place to live and some food? It was about this time Julius Caesar came about, but for as famous as he was, his chapter in the book of ancient Rome was rather short. During the civil wars, he defeated rival generals and literally banged Cleopatra and gave her the Egyptian throne. Pretty crazy history class crossover episode. After some time with Cleopatra, Caesar returned to Rome, giving himself the title of Imperator, which means victorious commander, and essentially became a dictator. The people saw the writing on the wall and assassinated him rather swiftly. So yeah, there you go. That's the story of Julius Caesar. His rule only lasted 4 years. After Julius Caesar's assassination, his 19-year-old nephew came to power and ended up ruling for 43 years. He didn't abolish the Republic, but didn't necessarily relinquish total control either. He gave himself the title of First Senator, essentially an all-powerful political being, but although he had this power, he was able to not be assassinated. During his rule, times were relatively peaceful. Bread was given to the poor, gladiators were cooler than ever, and the city began to see early signs of modernization. After this peaceful period, there was an era of notably bad emperors that imposed ridiculous laws and did pretty horrible things. But then after that era, there was an era of good emperors, the most notable of which, and the last of which, was Marcus Aurelius, a man who was in power from 161 AD to 180 AD. He spent most of his reign on military expeditions, and in between battles he wrote Meditations, a book that today is still a bestseller and one of the most profound examples of Stoic philosophy. I'd recommend giving it a read. After Marcus Aurelius came his son, and under the rule of his son began the end of the good times, and the beginning of the end began. Not long after, the Roman Empire was split into 4 states with 4 leaders, which did not last long as turmoil between the leaders and the states broke out into large-scale war. For a brief period afterwards, Rome was united once more for a final time, and the last emperor of the United Roman Empire ended his reign in 395 AD, and then his son split Rome into, for good, East and West. The eastern half would live on for another 1,000 years, but the western half would suffer and fall victim to the great migration of people, causing divide. So now that you have some context about ancient Rome, what caused it to fall? As you may have gathered, it wasn't just one thing, but more of a combination of things. You may already have some assumptions based off the context I provided, and if you're informed, you may already have your own opinions. But what I'm about to describe are, in my opinion, the top 3 reasons why Rome ultimately fell. 1. Corruption and mismanagement. As you've probably noticed, it's not entirely impossible to believe that corruption was pretty common in the Roman Empire, and more specifically, all parts of ancient Rome. Ancient Rome went through multiple iterations of political structures, from monarchies, republics, to eventually empires, not to mention the sheer number of rulers in general. A funny example of blatant mismanagement was Commodus. He was the youngest emperor ever at only 15 years old. He was known to be a reckless, emotional ruler, which was obviously a recipe for disaster. The systems built by those before him made the day-to-day operations of the Roman Empire more or less self-sustaining and hard to mess up. However, smaller things were definitely not as much of a challenge. Dude was literally a wannabe dictator/gladiator. And even though he was known as a reckless, emotional teenager, he was still in power for 15 years, until he was eventually assassinated in a bathhouse. 193 CE followed Commodus's rule and became known as the Year of the 5 Emperors, which, as you can probably assume, was because there was 5 different emperors in one year, one of which was assassinated in only 3 months, and another one literally bought his way into power and was killed 3 weeks later. The unity and the morale of the Roman Empire was low due to political chaos. The sheer size of the empire and the separation of the settlements made it easy for the different states to begin growing their own cultures and expressing their own autonomy, which eventually led to them breaking away and starting their own empires entirely. The whole mismanagement situation kind of reminds me of a job I had when I was younger. I used to work at a restaurant, and the owner of this restaurant kept hiring the weirdest managers. Like, me and my coworkers all did great jobs. We all knew how to do our jobs, but every manager that came in was convinced that they knew how to do our job better than us. This happened so frequently that eventually me and my coworkers had no respect for the manager, and we honestly were just not interested in listening to this 45-year-old meth enjoyer try to tell us how to do our job. So that didn't last long. We didn't go ahead and start our own restaurant, but we might as well have. 2. Religious discourse. The Roman Empire traditionally worshipped the pantheon led by Jupiter, which was heavily tied to the Greek pantheon led by Zeus. When Christianity began to gain popularity, the new Abrahamic faith, based off of the not so highly favored Judaism, was treated rather similarly as a result. The Roman Empire saw new faiths as a threat to the empire as a whole. This religious discourse between the empire and the people and the people and the people was brutal. Larger, bloodier battles have been fought over smaller issues. Just look at modern examples for the destruction that can be caused over religious disagreements. Rome didn't have any external religions gaining popularity within Rome, like Judaism, for example. Rome literally played a key element in the creation of Christianity, which made it an entirely different battle. Now, obviously we know how the story ends, as Greek and Roman polytheistic religions are now referred to as mythology, yet Christianity is one of the most worshipped religions in the world. I feel like this is often more overlooked than it should be, or maybe I'm just looking too far into it, but I definitely feel like the transition of faith was the beginning of the transition out of the Roman Empire. Christianity was eventually mass adopted within the Roman Empire, and the church had massive power, although not everyone was totally on board. I feel like this has less to do with the fall of Rome itself, but at the time when Christianity was initially being introduced, Rome was already in chaos, and I feel like the introduction of this religious discourse on top of political discourse definitely poured more fuel on the fire. 3. Outside opposition. Reasons number 1 and 2 are not exclusive to the Roman Empire and appear in every civilization at some point, because at the end of the day, all political structures are just groups of people, and people are dumb. My third and final reason falls into this basket as well too, but I believe this reason to be the most major nail in the coffin, as reasons 1 and 2 alone would have been able to sustain the Roman Empire for much longer, but reason 3 could have easily wiped out the Roman Empire by itself, And with the Roman Empire being more vulnerable from the chaos caused by the corruption and religious discourse, I believe that this third reason is the most important factor in Rome's demise. Let's focus in on one group of outside opposition to Rome. The Huns were a nomadic people, consisting of some of the most ruthless warriors of the time. They had been living across Asia and Eastern Europe, and wherever they were, others weren't. They left a trail of terror wherever they went, to put it lightly. And although they didn't interact with ancient Rome until later on, they still had a big impact on how Rome fell. The massive Hun conquests caused major influxes of refugees into the Roman Empire. Now, like we originally mentioned, refugees are what helped build Rome originally, but unfortunately, this was not the same Rome, and these were not the same refugees. Originally, people came to a growing, thriving Rome as an accepting safe haven. But in this case, the refugees were surviving barbarian warriors fleeing the Huns, and they were being thrown into the middle of the chaos of the Roman Empire of the time. It seems obvious to try to incorporate these refugees into the Roman army, right? Well, not to the emperor at the time, as instead of incorporating them into the Roman army, they were exposed for labor or outcasted as they were deemed not a threat. This lack of foresight at scale left a lot of unhappy outsiders inside the empire, causing many parts of the outer regions to be taken by these refugees. Keep in mind, originally, when refugees came to the Roman Empire, they were accepted and given citizenship. These refugees were not. They were not accepted, and they were not exiled for the most part. They were simply in a purgatory of sorts. After the split of the Roman and Byzantine Empire, this problem only got worse and harder to manage as Rome had limited resources and men to fight. In 476 AD, a barbarian king was the last to invade the Roman Empire as we know it, essentially concluding the fall of the Roman Empire. Although ancient Rome was no longer, to this day, the impact of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire is still very visible, mainly Christianity as a whole, which for the 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell, still served primarily as the government across all of Europe. The Roman Empire had so much land to manage, too little funding for their army, too much chaos for sustainability, and too little progress for growth. One thing I do want to quickly mention is that this is more of a bro history lesson than anything else. So if you're looking for something to plagiarize for a school assignment, unless you want to get expelled, I'd suggest watching this just for fun. Trust me, bro.